Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Gina Fong. Gina is a consumer anthropologist who believes that giving someone the gift of understanding is one of the most human-centric acts one can do. As a clinical assistant professor at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University in Chicago, she teaches the marketing elective Ethnographic Customer Insights. Gina loves transforming the classroom into a curiosity gymnasium so that students learn how to think with their head, heart, and gut. She was voted the L.G. Lavengood Outstanding Professor of the Year by Kellogg's 2023 graduating class. And you will see in this conversation at least a little evidence as to why that might have been the case. And as principal of Fong Insight, Gina conducts ethnographic research, coaches organizations to be consumer-centric, and delivers keynote speeches around the world. No matter what the situation, her goal is to help business leaders become joyful customer advocates. And a lot of her work is centered around understanding customers. But as we talk about right in the beginning of this, all of what we're going to talk about totally applies to how you understand any other human being, whether it's your employees, the team that reports directly to you, even your family at home. The skills that Gina talks about in here can be applied to create more empathy, create more curiosity, and really get to know people in a better, more meaningful way so that you can have better, more meaningful interactions with them. This was fantastic. Gina was amazing, and there is a ton in here that people can use to have better interactions with other people. I hope it helps you. Here is Gina Fong. Gina, welcome to the show. Very excited to learn all about what it means to be a consumer anthropologist today. So welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me.
That is where I'm going to start. So what is a consumer anthropologist and what is ethnographic research?
Great questions. And they're tied together, especially in the way that I introduce myself. So I am trained to be an ethnographer, but I've noticed over the years that no one really understands that term, or they haven't heard of it. And I understand that. In fact, my own family is still unsure of what I do for a living. And so I was trying to come up with a different way to talk about being an ethnographer. And really, ethnography is born from the social science of anthropology. So I thought, well, I do, in some terms, anthropology in business. So why don't I just say I'm a consumer anthropologist? And so that's really, in my mind, what consumer anthropology is. It's applying the practice of anthropology to business. And ultimately, what I think consumer anthropology is about is studying consumers so we can make, as marketers, better products and services. Now, ethnography itself is a methodology, and it's a way to get closer to a person. In anthropology, it is the method you use to study cultures. And so there is that parallel in business where I'm the person, strangely enough, that goes into people's homes to study how they use products and brands so that I can go back to marketers and organizations and say, this is how we need to improve a product, or this is what your consumers already love about your product.
So for today's conversation, I think, consumer research is great. And every company out there, every business leader who listens to this show, they're trying to provide some good or service to customers and clients. And so that element is good. But I also think, we have a lot of people leaders who listen to this show. And so is it fair to say that employee anthropologist would be a way that we could apply some of the ethnographic skill set as well?
Oh, I love that term. Yes, I think employee anthropology is a great way to think about it because ultimately anthropology is a study of humans. So I get this question a lot. Can we apply it to our clients? Yes. Can you apply it to your employees? Yes. You could even apply it at home with your spouse, your partner, your loved ones that you live with. It's so interesting because what I think I'm doing in my workplace is trying to understand people so deeply that you can surprise and delight them with an experience, with a product, with a brand.
And we are definitely going to get into how you do that. But before we do, just for the business leaders out there who are listening to this, who are like, yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, we do employee surveys. Sure. We get customer data. We understand what our employees want. We do pulse surveys to check their mood. How is ethnography different than the way that employers might be surveying their people today?
Yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing this question up because we do a lot of surveys. The tools over the years have gotten so great, and people have a natural affinity for quantitative data. You get nice sample sizes, you see actual numbers. It's incredibly comforting. And I'm not here to poo-poo quantitative data or surveys, but I do think there is a partnership between the quantitative and the qualitative data. And so the way I like to explain it to my students in the MBA school is that data, what we get from the surveys, explains the what, but you also need the why, the motivations behind the what. And that's where qualitative research comes in, and specifically ethnography, because when you watch someone in their home interacting with a product, or you're actually talking to them about why they do what they do, you get a richer sense of what's going on in their lives so that you can figure out how to surprise and delight them. So to me, you can't have the what without the why, but it's really important to understand the purpose of quantitative data versus qualitative, because it's not an either or. And sometimes I think people get into that trap where they think, oh, we can only do one or the other. And I think you need both. So I'm not even here to say that qualitative research is the be all end all. If I were doing qualitative research, there's still quantitative research that I recommend to my clients that they need to explore.
Yeah, I like that differentiation between the what and the why. So, hey, let's get all the numbers to figure out what's happening. And then let's go in and do this deeper research to figure out the why behind that. I mean, I think we can all think of scenarios where we've missed one or the other, right? We know why somebody is motivated to do something. We don't really know what that's turning into downstream, or we know what's happening downstream and we try to solve that problem without really understanding why that problem was created in the first place. We see that all the time.
Yes. My student said to me once, she said, I used to think that insight was, oh, my customer eats 5 candy bars a week, and they would stop right there. But you need to know why. And that's where that qualitative, the ethnography, more of the consumer anthropology comes into play.
Yeah. I don't care why. I just want them to eat 7. That's what I want. I like setting the table on some of this stuff a little bit. So what are we looking to learn? I mean, I guess maybe the answer is just the why, but what are we looking to learn versus what can't we learn from ethnographic research?
Yeah.
Is it just the difference between why and what, or is there some more nuance to that?
Yeah. I think there is some difference in the what versus why. So when you go into a consumer's home, there's only so much you can understand in terms of the what, meaning you might see someone doing something in their home, and then a client might ask me, well, how many people do that? You know, they see some weird behavior or some nuanced behavior, and then they want to know how many. And I say, I can't do that in qualitative for you. We will have to deploy a survey and figure out how many people do that sort of behavior. And then depending on the skill set of the ethnographer, there is a range of what you can capture. I mean, if you're a beginning ethnographer, you might not know how to go deeper with a consumer. And so you might get some superficial answers, versus if you're a little bit more experienced and you're able to establish a really good rapport with your consumer, then you can dive a little deeper. And that's where a lot of the richness comes out. But I think more of it is a skill set. And depending on where you are in your journey, you can get a little bit deeper with your consumer.
That's going to tease some questions I have for you later, but we'll get to those later. One thing that just occurred to me as you were saying that is, it sounds like there's kind of a chicken or the egg thing happening here, where you can start with the why and get a bunch of different whys and then use that to create some kind of survey to get the quantitative data. Or you could do it the other way around and do the mass survey to figure out what's happening and then go down to figure out why. It seems like you could play it both ways. Is there a best practice, or is it kind of like, hey, let's just keep cycling through both?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question. This is probably the question I get asked most by new clients. And my answer is it depends. So I'll play out a couple scenarios for you. Let's say a client comes to me and they say, we just don't have any idea where to get started. I might suggest they start with quantitative data first and deploy that survey and understand, because qualitative research is expensive. It's not very scalable. So if you do the quant work up front, it helps me understand where to focus my efforts. The metaphor or analogy I like to use is, if I'm doing home improvement and I say to my contractor, well, how much is it going to cost? He always says to me, I don't know until I break that wall down and look what's behind it. And that's what quantitative data helps us do, is it kind of helps us figure out where we should focus our efforts. Otherwise, sometimes you could go into qualitative research and then say like, oh, this wasn't as fruitful as we thought. We might have to go over here instead. And the quantitative data kind of helps us shine a light on where some of the more fruitful areas could be. Now, you could start with qualitative data first and go into the quant. And sometimes that is more useful when my clients have hunches about things, where they're feeling pretty good about where they should be going. Maybe you have someone who's been in the business a long time. Maybe people have some strong institutional knowledge, or maybe you work in a category that isn't that complicated. And so you don't have a lot of nuances that you have to navigate. We might do qualitative research first, and that might inform where to go with the quantitative research. Maybe they want to do a big survey, but they need some help figuring out how to create the survey. But they work in a category that's pretty straightforward. So if we do a little qualitative research, we can really guide the survey in a way that they get the most bang for their buck.
It's like, we know it's going to be kind of one of these couple of different things. Let's just do some quick research and figure out which of these we want to focus on, and then we'll go deploy the survey. Yeah.
And sometimes I'll do qualitative research for clients because they're not sure what language to use in the survey. And that's really helpful, just to have consumers talking. And then you can say, oh, this is a much better word or phrase or a way to tee it up so they understand what we're talking about. Because again, sometimes you ask questions in quantitative research, and if you don't ask the question in the right way, it will definitely skew the data you collect.
Yeah. Well, it's been said on this show many times, words matter. And the word choice that you use can have a big impact on what you get back or the way people interpret what you're saying.
Absolutely.
So that resonates with me. You teach classes on this, and we don't have enough time for that. But what are the basics of how to conduct ethnographic research?
Oh, well, may I walk you through the general structure of my class then?
I would love it if you would.
Okay. All right. So I teach a 10-week MBA class, and students come in and they're there from a variety of backgrounds. Some of them are entrepreneurs themselves, and they know they want to do this for themselves. Some of them know that they're going to be brand managers at a consumer products good company or another organization. So they know that while they won't do the research, they need to be skilled enough to have that conversation with the people that they'll be hiring. And then everyone in between. I've had finance majors come into my classroom because they say, I'm so quant focused and I need to balance myself out. Or I love these personal leadership classes that I took, and I feel like this would be another great way to understand humans. So I love when students come to me from all these different backgrounds. But what we do over the 10 weeks is based on a real life client project. So I get one of my clients from my consulting practice to sponsor the class. And recently now, because I've been teaching long enough, I've got former students who are now in their own companies that come back to sponsor my class, which is really
cool. Fun. Yeah.
But the whole point is that the project or the client's project has to be a real world, real life project, something that they've had on their minds that they want to solve for, because that is a good use of their time in sponsoring the class. The students are excited because they're actually got skin in the game for this. And then it's got to be something that's easily teachable in the classroom. So that's the trifecta of how we choose client sponsors for the course. And so with this real world sponsor, they go through this 10-week experience where first we learn how to be really curious. We learn how to be introspective. We learn what empathy really means in business. And to me, this is part of my framework called the insight muscle, where I teach them how to have a mindset so that you can really get close to your customer. And that mindset, again, is curiosity, it's introspection, it's empathy. And I think those are really important to start out with, because there's a famous quote by, I'm trying to remember his name right now, but it's escaping me and it's right at the tip of my tongue. So maybe I'll remember it a little later. But he says, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. He says, if you can't change your mind, you can't change anything at all. And that is really the way I want my students to come into class. And, I think the playwright was George Bernard Shaw. That's who it's attributed to.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important because as designers, as entrepreneurs, as brand managers, we come into research already with a hypothesis. And everyone thinks that in qualitative research, you should come in with a hypothesis to prove or disprove. And I really don't think that's the best way to do things, because then you look to either prove or disprove. And then as soon as you've gotten to that point, you might not explore all the other richness around you. Now, I think it's okay to have a hunch as long as you keep it contained.
You're not attached to it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's the other problem, right? Is it's easy to find data to support whatever it is that you want to support and ignore the data that's showing you something else.
Yeah, absolutely. So I say to my students, don't go in saying we've got to prove this or disprove it, because as soon as you get there, you'll stop. And that's why this mindset's so important. So curiosity, introspection, empathy. I cannot emphasize enough how much that lays the groundwork for really solid consumer research.
Yeah. It's similar. I mean, we talk as our sales team in the company that I work with. We work with a sales trainer who's been great. She's been on the show. Shout out to Pam Evanson. But we talk about the mindset that we go into every new opportunity with. And if you are going in trying to prove that you're the right partner, it just isn't going to come off in a pleasant way for anybody. Whereas if you go in being curious and trying to be helpful, you may lead your way out of the opportunity because you may lead them to a different path, but ultimately you're going to win more opportunities because you're really helping the other person solve their problem. And so I like that mindset of just not trying to prove or disprove anything, but just trying to be curious and understand what the current situation actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the second part of my insight muscle framework is the skill set. So skills we use every day as humans, but as a consumer anthropologist, as a market researcher, you got to ratchet those skills up. And they are observing, listening, and inquiring. So really understanding those nuances when you're watching someone do something in their home, listening incredibly intently, and then asking all the right questions. That's equally as important. And then once we have that framework established, then we can get into the nuts and bolts of what consumer research looks like. So I can dive into that if you'd like, but there are particular milestones, particular documents, and specific things you have to do in order to set yourself up for success in terms of consumer research.
So I would love to dive into those here in a second, but want to talk about the observe, listen, and inquire for a moment. We've all heard about the importance of being better listeners and active listening and passive listening and everything to do with listening. I think on this show, we've talked a little bit about how to ask better questions, although I'd love to get into that in a little bit too. What about observation? How do we become better observers? That's an interesting thought.
Yeah. Well, I have my students go through a couple of different exercises in class. And one of them is really to look for a point of contrast. So a lot of times what happens is we're told, well, look and observe, and someone will come back to me and they'll say, I don't know what I'm looking at. Yeah. And I'll say, I think you need a point of contrast. And one of the best examples I could share with you is one of the earlier classes that I taught. We studied a subculture and I chose salsa dancers. And on a Saturday evening further observation exercise, I asked students to come down to a salsa club in Chicago with me. And I said, when you're done observing these salsa dancers, you're going to have to be able to identify what makes a salsa club dancer. And they were a little terrified because no one in my MBA class was a salsa dancer, but it was exactly the reason why I chose this subculture. I wanted it to be as unfamiliar as possible to them. So we get to the club and they notice so many things. But the problem is they say, we don't know if this is pertinent to salsa club dancers or just social dancers or club dancers. And I knew this was coming and I had planned another activity. And I said, yes, you need a point of contrast. So we walked down the street to a Chicago blues club. And if you've ever been in a Chicago blues club versus a salsa club, boy, are they very different experiences. And once they walked into that club, immediately they knew. They said, oh, now we know what makes a salsa club dancer a salsa club dancer. So that's one technique I like to use with my students, is this idea that you have to look for a point of contrast. And it works even in research. If a client calls me and says, well, we want to study our most loyal users, I say, great. We should probably also study maybe your least loyal users or loyal users of your competitive brand or something. So we really understand where your consumers really sit within this landscape.
Because, you need some comparison point.
Absolutely.
Really interesting. It's no wonder you got voted by your students Teacher of the Year if you're taking them to salsa and blues clubs in Chicago on Saturday nights. That makes a lot more sense now.
Oh, well, they were terrified because I told them at some point they had to get on the floor and dance too, like become part of the subculture. So I think that was a little nerve-wracking for them for sure.
That's amazing. I have been to both of those types of clubs in Chicago, and I can attest they are different experiences. Yeah. Both very fun in their own way. So let's go to inquire then.
Okay.
I know I said we were going to skip that, but let's go to inquire for a second because, okay, we've observed, we've seen the contrast, we've listened, but now I could see like it would help to go out and pull a salsa dancer aside and ask some questions just to clarify something. So how do we improve our ability to inquire?
Yeah. I think it comes back to that mindset, that idea that we have to stay curious. And a lot of times we don't realize this, but we ask questions that are already loaded. So for example, we ask questions, and this is something I've noticed over time. We pre-populate the answers for people. We ask a question and then we give them a couple options, like it's multiple choice. And to me, that's tricky because you're already leading someone down a path and directing them. And they may have not gone down that path if you didn't say it that way. So I think one of the things to do is to get really curious and just be open-minded about your questions. Try not to lead people. Try not to, quote unquote, help them, and just let the question be and let them sit around in that and answer it the way they want to. That really, the way I define curiosity in my classroom is wonder without judgment. Can we just wonder without judgment and ask a question and just let whatever answer comes back to us, come back to us?
I got to write that down. Wonder without judgment. I love that. So is it a myth then that we should be helping people who are struggling to think of a couple options because they'll think of more options? I think like that's the thing that I've heard before sometimes is, oh, well, if you give people 2 or 3 options, then they can start to extrapolate and maybe they'll come up with more. You can sort of like start the brainstorming for them. But what I'm hearing from you is maybe not, or at least don't rush down that path too fast.
Yeah, I definitely agree not to rush down that path too quickly. So if I ask a question and you can see the wheels turning in the other person's mind, the first thing I coach my students to do is to just let them be. Give it a beat is what I say in class all the time. Because what the initial response from the interviewer is, oh my goodness, there's all of this dead space. I've got to fill it up. This is uncomfortable. And most of the time it's not, because the other person is thinking. Yeah. And it's great to have that space to just roll around in the question and form your thoughts. So they're probably not thinking about the space the way that the interviewer is. So first of all, just give them the beat. And then second of all, I think what's helpful is if they need assistance, to do it in a way that isn't very prescriptive. So I might ask a question, and then if you can see a respondent or a consumer struggling a little bit and it's clear that they need help, I might give them another example in a different category just to give them that analogy versus say, how about X or Y that tends to be in the category already.
I like that. Yeah. It takes a little more work to come up with an analogy in a different category, but I see how beneficial that could be, that now you're not leading them down the path. You're just helping them make the connections in their head.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes people need a little bit of help. They aren't sure where to go and they just need that spark. And so I find that the analogy is more helpful than giving them an actual word. Well, how about this product attribute? And then all of a sudden you have a conversation about that because they're like so grateful just to have something to answer that they go down that path.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And I love your comment on holding space, because I've seen that play out in the work that I do too. And I've had to tell teams that I work with sometimes who don't have a sales background, like, if I ask a question and they don't say anything, don't come to their rescue. Let's just be uncomfortable for a minute. And inevitably, to your point, like, people are thinking and they'll come up with something. And the longer you give them, the more likely it is that it'll be something deeper and more truthful.
Yeah.
So then what are the actual practices that you had alluded to earlier? Like, what are the actual steps to doing the research?
Yeah. So the first thing that students do in my class is they meet the client, and we call that the client brief. So the client comes in and they talk about the project and why they are interested in understanding their consumers, and then what the research will help them do. Based on that, we create what I call a project scope, and that is a recap of the brief that the client gave us, along with what are the research objectives. And now research objectives are different from what the client objectives are. And I call the client objectives the project objectives. And those are, what does the client actually need to get done with this research versus the research objectives, which are really more focused on the consumer. But what happens is people confuse the two. And then that's where research gets misused. This is a hypothetical research objective I've seen that I think is incorrect. And that is figure out which ad campaign consumers like better. And to me, that's not a research objective. It really should be that project or client objective, because that's ultimately what the client has to do with the research. Research, in my opinion, should not make decisions for marketers and business leaders. It should provide clarity and confidence to their decisions, but it should not make the decision for them.
So what would be the better research objective in that scenario?
Yeah. Understand what is relevant in a consumer's life when it comes to XYZ product or category, or you can even say directly understand what the client loves or what the consumer loves or doesn't love about this ad. You know, that's all fair game for research objectives, but to place a decision on the research itself, I think is asking a little bit too much.
Yeah. I mean, which one does somebody like more? That's just A/B testing that you could do with any kind of general research without doing specific ethnographic research, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And in this case, you know, what I'm talking about too is when we ask these kinds of questions about advertising, you also want to get to the why, as we talked about earlier, that difference between the what and the why. Because when you understand the why of a consumer, then you can go back and you can change things you need to change without going back and testing every iteration. Because when you understand someone at their core, you can then design that experience for them. But if you test, should the package be blue or red, which I understand needs to be tested, but if you decide to go with green, then you got to go back and do more research. Yeah. And you have to keep testing every iteration. But when you understand the core of who someone is, it's so much more predictive.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think of like Nike, for example, and their statement, just do it, right? Their tagline. Just do what? Like, what does that mean? But there are so many people out there with that desire to do something, whether that's get in shape or compete at a high level or anywhere in between. That one saying can be harnessed in so many different ways. If you understand that as the basic motivator, the basic why that people are driven to do things, then just do it becomes something that you can use in a huge array of different messages and mediums and expressions. And that's why they've never changed their tagline. And they've been able to use that. And it's still so relevant today when they launch a new ad campaign.
Yes, absolutely.
Any other steps? I know I kind of keep jumping in here, but anything that we haven't covered yet?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure there is.
Yes. So once we create the project scope, and that's just really a blueprint and an agreement between client and researcher. Like we're on the same page, literally, this is what we seek to understand. Then what my students do is they have to figure out which consumers are best suited for this research. Like whom are we going to learn from? And we have to sit down and think that through. And then there's another document that comes up, which is what we call a screener in the market research world. And that is a simple survey. Many of us have probably filled one out before with a couple of questions that helps us identify, do you qualify for the study or not? If you're doing a study on salsa dancers, probably one of the criteria in the screener is, how often do you salsa dance? Because if you salsa dance 0 or 1 time a year, you might not be as helpful as if you're going to a club every week. So you've got to really figure out, who are we going to learn from? And that screener helps us screen for people who belong in the study versus not. And so that's the next phase. And then you schedule your consumers, and then you write a discussion guide. And a discussion guide is basically a list of questions that you have in your back pocket. You use them as a way to feel comfortable in the conversation because you've thought everything through, but you don't want to be so prescriptive that you use it as a script. And I'm sure you've encountered this many times, O'Brien, where
we were talking about this before. Yeah.
you have questions on your discussion guide, but a consumer can bring something up that you never thought about before. And then what do? Well, you chase that. You go towards that. You don't say to yourself, well, it's not on my guide, so I can't ask that question, because sometimes that's where the best richness comes from. So that
I would argue that's usually where the richness comes from.
So that guide is a really lovely balance of being prepared, but being open and nimble to what might come your way that you haven't planned for. Yeah.
Have you ever taken improv classes?
I've taken one-off improv classes, so I haven't gone through, a 10-week series or done them at any length, but improv is very similar in that way because I've taken the workshops and I think they have a lot of similar principles.
Yeah, that's what it made me think of, because I did Second City's Improv A, which is their intro level, I think it's 8 or 10 week improv class. And the whole thing is about getting yourself out of your own head so that you can be in the moment reacting to the people around you. And it's hard to do. I mean, it is a practice that you need to work on. But when you can do it, it allows you to get into that flow so that you are just naturally following those interests and those curiosities. And you can just kind of go there without having to think about it too much. And I think there's a ton of benefit to people taking improv classes. Even if you just take the first most basic one, it just gives you like a flexibility and pliability in your brain that it's really hard to get elsewhere.
Yeah. In fact, I recommend to my students and people that I coach, when they say, how do I get better at this? Sometimes it's not always, well, just do more of these. I mean, that does help. I say, go take an improv class. I say, go travel, because when you're in someone else's environment, that ratchets up the observing, the listening, the inquiring, the being curious, because you're in someone else's world and you really see it from a different point of view. And it makes you a little bit more attuned to all the nuances and details. So to me, sometimes doing other things, as you say, to support this skill set is really great. I think the other thing to do too, which I highly recommend to my students, is to pick up a hobby that you are going to be really bad at, because it teaches you that humility and that curiosity.
Yeah. I love that. Because we forget that, right? That we were bad at the things that we're good at now. And I feel like so many adults, kids do it too, but adults definitely keep themselves living small, I'll say, because they're just not willing to go out and bear the burden and the discomfort of being a beginner again, that beginner's mindset. So I love that as an exercise and a challenge for people to go out and do something you're not going to be good at.
Yeah, yeah.
I see it. I have 2 young children. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And it's amazing to watch them. And I even have to remind myself, there's a basic task and they do it for the first time and they're terrible at it. Like, I'm sitting there watching it going like, come on, like you've got to, it's right there. You should be able to figure this out. Right. And that's just like my own issue. But then inevitably, like they come back to it a week later and they're so much better. They're still pretty bad, but they're so much better. And then, another week goes by and another week goes by and eventually they're great at the thing. And it is amazing to watch that learning process literally from the beginning happening. And it's a good reminder for me just to say, oh yeah, I'm this way too. There are things that I'm bad at, but I can learn them if I apply them.
That's a great example.
Yeah. The other thing I really like from what you were saying is just the idea of practicing curiosity. As you said that, it occurred to me that there are probably not a lot of people out there that have a way in their lives that they are practicing curiosity. I'm blessed because I have this podcast. I mean, my day job in sales, I have to be curious about the people I'm working with, and getting to do this podcast flexes that muscle. But I think the idea of finding some kind of practice or some kind of way in your life to practice curiosity would be hugely beneficial.
Absolutely. One of the things I ask my students to do is in week 5, we exchange subcultures, meaning we talk about a subculture that each of us belongs to. And I mean, like we're in it deep. And that's always really fun because we learn about subcultures that we didn't even know existed. Like I had a student who collected antique watches, which I know is a thing, but I didn't know there was a subculture built around it that people got together and talked about it and spent all this money on it together. And of course, there are the subcultures that you're used to seeing, like marathon runners. But then there are some that come up that you didn't even know were a thing. Like for me, one quarter, I had a bunch of students who were obsessed with the TV show The Bachelorette, and there was a whole subculture built around that.
Yeah.
And what I have my students do in class then is once we share our subcultures and everyone gets to know it, they have to pick a subculture that knew nothing about, and preferably if it's one that they're like, really? And then interview the other student to figure out, like, what is this subculture really about? And what happens at the end, which I find so delightful, is they end up getting into the subculture and really being immersed in it. And it just changes their point of view. And some of them go out and actually try the subculture themselves because they find it more interesting than when they started the exercise.
Yeah, I've seen that happen in my own life. I grew up and I was kind of interested in soccer, but not really. I played it like one season in high school and I thought it was kind of a fun game, but I wasn't that interested. I never watched it at all. And then I lived in college with 2 guys who were big Premier League fans. And I remember watching a couple games with them and they explained everything that was going on and the strategy, and they were just geeking out over the whole thing. And I really enjoy watching soccer now. Like ever since living with those guys for a year, I really enjoy it because I understand, and I still don't understand it to their level, but I understand it a lot better. I see the difficulty in it. I see what they're trying to do and how much is on the line. And it's become a lot more fun for me to partake in that subculture. And so I think, to your point, once you get that experience, once you can see what everybody else sees as the insider, a lot more of the world becomes appealing.
It does. It does. And one of the reasons I like my students to do this is because you might work in a category one day where you don't understand your customer. You might not even like them. And so to fully immerse yourself into someone's world is important because I find once you understand someone, it's harder to dislike them. Yeah. And the core of business is you have to like your consumers. You have to be able to embrace them and understand them and want to do right by them. So I think it's just an important exercise to do. And the stronger we get at that and understanding others, it just opens a whole world for all of us.
Well, and if nobody listening's made this connection yet, this would be a great team building exercise to do with your team at work. Great way to get to know the people, have them know each other, create vulnerability, create trust, create empathy. I mean, that'd be a fantastic exercise to do.
It's quite fun. And I do it midway in the quarter so that we're all a little used to each other. So people feel a little bit more psychologically safe and won't pick a more acceptable subculture. Like, I'm a marathon runner. They'll get real deep into something that you're like, wow, I didn't even know that existed. And it's so much fun because we're all doing it together and it raises the curiosity naturally. And there's a lot of sharing, which ultimately that's what consumer research is about, is sharing.
Okay, let me ask you a question on that. As the facilitator of this exercise who wants to encourage people to go deep with this, do you share yours?
I do. I wait till they're done though. So the way this happens in my classroom is we have an online discussion board and you have to post and there's an assignment. So you have to be really specific and describe it. So you can't just say, I'm a marathon runner. I love to run. I've run 3 marathons, the end. So there's a specific assignment you have to follow in order to share. And then in a subsequent class, I talk about one of my subcultures, but I do infuse a lot of myself into the class. So they get to know me pretty well by the end of the quarter. And some of the reason I do that is because I think it's important for them to watch me introspect. And that's one of the mindset areas that I have them focus on in class. But introspection is not something we're all really practiced with. And it's a little bit more than just saying, oh, I'm aware of this today, or wow, I feel this way today. And so in class, I do a lot of introspection in front of them, which means revealing a lot of things about myself so they can see how it can be done.
Yeah, I love that. I'm just a big believer in leading with vulnerability to encourage vulnerability in other people. I see it at dinner parties. If I'm the host of a dinner party and I'm willing to share something personal or a struggle I'm dealing with, it winds up opening the conversation up so much more. And then with just a little bit of encouragement, you can really get a deep conversation going.
Yeah. And I'm acutely aware as the professor in the room that there is somewhat of a hierarchy, but I do want my students to understand that I'm a human being too. And I make just as many mistakes as the next person. I am just as scared as the next person. I have as many hangups as the next person. I just think doing this work for over 20 years, you just become more aware of yourself before you let yourself go too far. So it's that same way I teach biases. I say, I have the same biases that everyone else has. It's not like I have fewer biases. I just hopefully sense them a little sooner so I can rein them in and deal with them before they get a little too far down the path.
What are the best ways to keep bias from this type of research? Because I imagine a lot of this research, the output is interpretation. And anytime there's interpretation involved, there's an opportunity for bias to send this off course. So what are the best ways to create the most accurate interpretation we can get without our biases influencing it?
One of the exercises my students have to do is an introspection essay. And I relate it to whatever category we're participating in the moment. So one of my clients is a craft beer company, and the couple quarters that he has sponsored the class, the student's assignment has been an introspection essay on what it means to drink socially. And they have to write this essay about their motivations behind it. And so what it does is, first of all, it gets them deeper into the category they're about to study. It helps them understand their connection to the category. And ultimately, this isn't an easy assignment. They just can't say, I drink because it's fun, the end. And they have to dig really deep. And what it shows them is some empathy, because at some point they're going to interview someone about this very topic who hasn't had the chance to ruminate for a little bit. And it makes them way more empathetic because they say to themselves, this is harder than it looks. And when I'm in the ethnographer seat, I'm going to be in the driver's seat. I know which questions are coming. I know what I need. And that other person will have not had any preparation. And what happens in this introspection essay is they start to notice their own biases. They start to notice the assumptions, the hunches that they have. And they say, oh, wow, look at that. I got to be careful of that. Or, wow, oof, I didn't realize that about myself. Got to make sure that I don't put that part of myself into the ethnography.
So much of this, it seems like to become a good ethnographer, you really have to be improving yourself all the time.
Yeah, I do think so.
I work with a coach, and so much of what we do is just introspection on motivation and why I react certain ways to certain things. And that work is incredible. Like, I'll give you an example. Last week, we were talking about why I tend to not like a certain group of people. And in my work, I have shied away from interacting with that group of people. And I realized that it has nothing to do with that group of people. It has to do with how a few people made me feel a long time ago and how I kind of protect myself against that feeling again. And yet also immediately realized that now I'm almost a 40-year-old man who is very comfortable in who I am in almost every way. And so, like, why would I continue to let that affect me? And just that one little realization almost immediately unburdened me. And now it'll take a little while to go out and make it practice, and I'll have to, work on it again. But like, that kind of introspection can be so powerful. And that's really what good coaching is, right? Or good therapy is. And so much of what you've said already in this conversation is requiring of your students or anyone who wants to do this work, that type of deep self-work.
It is so important because ultimately, if you don't do this work, you can only work for companies, brands, organizations where you're the consumer. And I don't know how feasible that is throughout a long, successful career. Sure, founders, entrepreneurs start with a product that was missing in their lives. But at some point, I work with them when they say, we have to expand beyond the people that were like me. We've got to get to a new target market, but I don't know this target market. Now what do you do?
Yeah.
Or you'll go into an established company where they've already got a consumer that's not like you. What if you're a young 20-something and you're not a parent, but yet you work for a brand whose target market is parents? You have to have that mental flexibility to get into someone else's shoes, their lives, their houses, and understand the world from their point of view. So the way I like to think about it, and this is probably the most math out you'll get from a qualitative researcher like me, is when I use my mindset model of curiosity and introspection and empathy, I say to my students, curiosity plus introspection equals empathy.
I love that. Are there any, I've said this before, I know there are more, but what are the other kind of final steps to actually going out and having these interactions with people?
Yeah, so I think we've gone through the project scope, its screener, discussion guide. Then you go out and you get to do the actual ethnographies. And then when you come back into the classroom, I coach my students to analyze. And that's probably a whole nother episode on its own, O'Brien, about getting into qualitative data and really analyzing it properly. Because if people have looked at qualitative data, at best, most of us have a very superficial understanding of it. Now, part of the problem with that is your analysis is only as good as the data you collect. And then it really is a slippery slope if you haven't started on the right foot with asking good questions and being curious and introspective and empathetic. So that next stage is the analysis. And then ultimately where we end up in class is once we get to the insight, the motivation of the consumer, then we tell a story. So I teach my students how to tell the consumer story to the client in a way that will inspire the client to do something differently. Because it's not good enough to just dump analysis at the foot of the client.
No, it's not.
You have to be able to give it to them in a way that they can hear it and they want to do something about it. So I say to my students, the best compliment we could give in class is when the client cuts you off because they're already brainstorming and saying, oh my gosh, this makes perfect sense. Now I know what to do. Or they start creating an idea in the moment because they're so inspired.
Yeah, I love that. And that is a very good point. And it's why we all know the things that we need to do to improve our lives, and yet we don't do it. You know, we haven't been inspired to make that emotional connection yet. And it's why education alone does not work most of the time. So you skipped it. Well, then you go do the research and you ask the questions, you do these interviews, and it's easy. I do want to pick there because we kind of got into this element, but I want to make sure that we unpack it a little bit, which is, how do you help people go deeper when you are asking questions of them? Because so many people don't understand the why behind their own behavior, myself included. You know, the part of the coaching work that I'm doing is she'll just say, well, why do you believe that? You go to open your mouth and you realize very quickly that you don't really have an articulate answer. So how do you help the person that you're interviewing think at a deeper level when either they haven't before or it could be really uncomfortable for them to do?
Yeah. I think one of the most important things is to build a safe space for the consumer or the person you're talking to. So really making sure that you come with that curiosity. If people are curious, if the interviewer or the ethnographer is curious, the person on the other side knows that. When someone is curious about you, you're so willing to share at least a little bit more than you would with the person who's not curious.
It is a little bit of a drug.
It really is.
When somebody gives you that space and is curious, it really is a drug.
And I think this is why I'm in the work that I'm in, because I'm just super curious and I've just got to know. And I keep going in deeper and deeper and deeper. But to prepare someone, usually I give them before an ethnography a little bit of what I call light homework. And that light homework is just something for them to think about so that they can start understanding their own motivations, but not in a really deep way, because I don't want them to go so far down the path that they're not doing it with me in the moment. So, for example, going back to the craft beer project that we did together, my students, a few years ago, I had done research for this client. And of course, you go into a category like craft beer and people think they know what they're doing and what they're drinking, but there are so many layers below that. So one of the questions or the light homework that I gave to the consumers was this question. And I just said to them, and you have to make the homework light enough, otherwise people won't do it and it defeats the purpose. I said, I want you to think about how you would complete the sentence. And I want you to pick one word and we'll talk about it in the ethnography. And the sentence was, I am a blank beer drinker. And they had to use a word to describe themselves as a beer drinker. And I said, don't think of basic words like I'm a fun beer drinker, or I'm a regular beer drinker, or I'm a habitual beer drinker. I want a word that if I know this about you as a beer drinker, I pretty much know everything about you. And it's a fun exercise for consumers to do. They think about it. They talk to their friends about it. And then we get in the interview and they're ready to go, but they're not over ready.
Yeah. Well, just in trying to pin down one word, there's so much thinking that has to go on. And you're like pumping the muscle full of blood flow, kind of getting it going, priming it for the workout that you're going to give them. I could see, because even as I was thinking about the answer to that question, all of a sudden your brain starts to go in so many different directions. So it's not just, they only have to answer this one little question. Like, that's easy. It prompts so much thinking.
It does. It does. And then it forces a choice, because it's so easy to be like, I'm these 15 words. But when you have to force the choice, then it starts to distill into the true motivation of someone. Yeah.
Well, I imagine what also happens is people want to explain the rest of it too. And so they're primed to say, well, no, but I want to explain this, and it's not just this. And now they're just kind of willingly sharing what you want to know anyway.
Yes, that's
I like
so
that.
true.
That's a great Jedi mind trick. I need to spend some time thinking about that one. A couple final questions that I want to ask just to kind of wrap up some of this a little bit. One is that I have heard from mostly like animal research that being in the environment changes the environment, can change behavior in the environment. So how do you think about that as an ethnographer when you're going into a salsa club to observe and interview salsa dancers, that maybe you're actually changing their behavior a little bit?
It's inevitable. You can't hide. It's not like I'm in camouflage at a salsa club necessarily, or even in a consumer's home where they know I'm coming and they know we're going to talk about how they wash their floor, for example. But what you do is you try to create that really fun, safe space. And one of the things I say to them, and this is why there is an industry of people like me, is I don't work directly for any of the companies we're going to talk about today. I am truly here as your advocate, and I am here to help solve your problems. So the more you share with me, the better the products are going to be eventually in the marketplace. And that gives people real license then to go for it. The other thing that I do in the ethnography is you create an activity. And sometimes it's super straightforward. Like if I am working with a cleaning company, I watch how people are washing their floors. And what that does is it gets them into their flow. They don't think so much about what am I saying and doing, because they're in their natural habitat doing this thing that they always do. And I get to observe. And that curiosity that comes as a result, not, well, why are you washing your floor that way? But wait, hold on a second. You're doing this before this. I'm so intrigued. What's behind that? I've got to know more.
So I've heard that asking why questions can make people defensive, to say, why are you doing this? Is that a best practice for you as well, using what or how questions versus why questions?
Yes. And you've got to vary it up, because if every time someone says something, you go, but why, but why, but why, that just gets really boring. Yeah. And so there are lots of different ways to ask the why question. There's a lot of ways you can ask it with tone too. Like I'm like, I've got to know why you do this. This is so amazing. And someone's like, well, let me tell you why I wash my floor this way, because they can tell you're really into it. You want to know. So I think it's a combination of how you ask it, but also the actual words.
Thank you. Want to move this over into the really practical for the people who are listening, who are hopefully still listening to this. For people leaders in a business, how can they start to practice this with their teams, with their employees? What are the easy ways to get into this, to start to make it a habit?
Yeah. I think one of the easiest ways is to just start talking to your employees one-on-one, which is what ethnographic research is, and be curious. I think that's really hard to do in the workplace because we have jobs. We have responsibilities. We have things that we are accountable for. So of course, it is hard to stay curious when you know you have to get a ball across the finish line, or you're highly responsible for this and your reputation's on the line. But just getting to know other people at a baseline, I think, is super important. The other thing that I would encourage leaders to do in the workplace is actually find out a problem their employees are having and try to solve it by understanding the problem itself through their lens. And I'll make this up. Maybe there is a procedure at the office or a piece of software or something that employees are doing that you generally know people aren't happy about. Go up to them and say, can I see how you're doing this? Because I'm trying to fix this process. And by watching you do it and you talking in real time about what's working or not working will help me try to figure out how to make this better for you. I mean, that goes so far with people.
Yeah. What that makes me think of is this concept of operating at 90% all the time. And so I heard somebody say this, talking about being able to be agile, that if you're operating at 100%, there's no room for anything else. And so if you're operating at 90%, then you've got you're still highly functional, but you've got the opportunity to slow down, take some time with a team member, handle a new project that comes in. You can kind of ebb and flow with the things that happen. And I think so many of us are keyed in, probably even over 100%, which is why so many people are burned out and stressed out. But if you can actually lower sort of the engagements that you have and allow for a little bit more time, because so many of these things that I've interviewed guests about on here that are helpful interpersonal skills, they just take time, and it takes somebody who's willing to slow down and pull somebody aside or pull a team aside and say, all right, let's spend some time on this and be purposeful. And so I would just encourage people to slow down a little bit, because these types of things are really opportunities to slow down, to go faster.
Yes. I do love that concept, because you do need a little bit of that wiggle room to be able to explore. Like going back to our discussion guide conversation, if you have a discussion guide and this is exactly how you want to ask questions, and then something comes up, you don't feel equipped to just follow that line of exploration.
Yeah. Well, I do have one more question on my question guide that I would love to ask you, because personally, I struggle with this. How do we get better at giving gifts?
Oh my goodness. So, I love to talk about gift giving as the metaphor for understanding someone else, because I think that if we are more thoughtful gift givers in our personal lives, we'll be more insightful marketers, business leaders, associates in our professional life. So I wrote an article about this in HBR Ascend, but I'll just recap 3 gift giving mistakes that I see happen in our personal lives that also happen in the workplace, meaning what we do as designers, innovators, managers, when we develop a brand or a product or experience for our consumers. And so if you can stay away from these 3 top mistakes, I think we'll all be better off for it. So the first one is avoid the me gift. And this is the gift we give that we really want for ourselves. And we've probably all been on the receiving end of this as well. You get that sweater, that jewelry, that book that really has nothing to do with you. And you're like, oh yes, that's what they like. So, yeah. But what that requires is putting yourself in someone else's shoes, being curious, being empathetic and saying, I'm going to see this from someone else's point of view. And then the second one is what I call the gift of the generic. That's the gift we kind of phone in. It's the gift card. It's the cash where we say, oh, here, you just figure it out. And my students push back on this all the time. They say, but that's what they want. And I say, yes, we would prefer cash and gift cards as a society, because as in general, we have gotten so bad at gift giving. It's just easier to do it this way. But when you give someone cash in most situations, what you're doing is you're not getting to know them better. And you're not having that opportunity to say, I'm going to figure out a way to really surprise and delight you.
Yeah.
And the third one is the should gift. And this is the gift that you give that's dripping with judgment. The gift you give someone because they should do something or they should be something. This is the gift that one of my students who is a father said he got for Father's Day. He got a tool because his wife thought he should be doing more chores around the house. It's that kind of thing.
Ouch. Those sting. So if you can avoid those and try to get somebody something that's a little more specific to them, that's how you up your game.
Absolutely. I mean, at least start there with the me gift. That alone will probably get you a lot farther than if not.
Okay. I had seen that article and I had seen you talking about the fact that you really enjoy gift giving. And that is something that I struggle with. And it is something that I think a lot of people struggle with, is to figure out how to really make something meaningful.
And I want to make the distinction. I'm not sure if I'm actually a good gift giver. I enjoy the process, but just like everyone else, it's hard, because if you don't know someone well, you have to do the research. You have to figure it out. And there are a couple people in my life recently where I know I'm going to have to give them a gift and I'm going to have to figure this out. Like last year, I had to do a lot of research because I had to give a gift to my 13-year-old niece. And that is a subculture that I'm not really familiar with. And it requires really understanding them from their point of view.
Well, you are primed to do that research and put yourself in a good position to give those gifts. And I think everybody else who's been listening to this is probably primed for that as well. So Gina, thank you for coming on the show and sharing your wisdom with us. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to share before we sign off?
I don't think so. I think you've done a great job asking questions and letting me explore some of these different paths. So thank you for the opportunity to be on this podcast. I really enjoyed it.
Well, I am very curious about this topic. And so this has been a lot of fun for me. And I hope it's been helpful for everybody who is listening. And I hope it helps you go out and have better interactions with your employees and give your people what they want so that they'll stick around longer and do better work and be happier and create better workplaces. So best of luck to everybody out there. Thank you for listening.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.